Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to today's program. We're going to just sit tight for a little while and see how many participants we have for today's program. Our third and final with Perry Hurt, I'm sad to say, but I'm excited about this one. I hope you all are too. Perry, is it as chilly in North Carolina as it is here in Fredericksburg today?
I thought the house was going to blow over last night. The winds were quite strong, and now this morning it's chilly out there. I was ready for summer to be here, I think. And yes, it's gotten kind of cold.
No, I was surprised the water in my bird bath froze last night.
Oh, geez.
Like, oh man, come on.
Well, I hope it didn't affect the flowers. I know Belmont's got beautiful flowers.
You know, I think it's fine for the flowers. It's almost like they're refrigerated, so they'll probably last a little longer. So when it gets really warm really fast, that's when the flowers are not happy. But this is good. They can deal with that.
Good.
They're tough. They're tough. All right, I'm going to wait just for a couple seconds more. Welcome to everyone who has signed on. Welcome to our presentation today. It's titled Hidden in the Paint, and it's a conservation retrospective. My name is Michelle Crow-Dolby, and I'm the Education and Communications Manager here at Gary Melcher's Home and Studio in Falmouth, Virginia. And today we have Perry Hurt joining us for his third and final program. Perry is the paintings conservator with the North Carolina Museum of Art, and he received his BFA in painting and printmaking and his subsequent conservation training from Virginia Commonwealth University. And he is going to be talking today about his professional relationship with our museum and our paintings, which spans over 30 years. And throughout the program, really to understand, art, it's really great to be able to get the feedback from a conservator. He's one of the foremost experts of Melcher's painting methods, having worked on more than 30 of Gary Melcher's paintings. So he's going to be talking today about, the whole scope of his work that he's done for Belmont. As a reminder, participants are encouraged to submit questions or comments in the Q&A or chat boxes at the bottom of your screen. And also this program is being recorded and will live on our YouTube channel in the very near future. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Perry, and let's have some fun.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'll make a comment real fast that for the most part, we'll leave questions and answers till the end, correct?
Right.
We'll just
unless I have a burning question at some point.
Of course.
And then I'll interrupt you.
You're running the show, Michelle. We're here. You just speak right up. Yeah, well, it's great to be here with everybody today. It's always fun to talk about Gary Melcher's and Belmont. Belmont is a beautiful place, especially this time in the spring. And I've known it for quite some time, which I'm going to touch base on just in a minute. Yes, I've worked with Belmont for 30 years or more, and I've treated at least 30 paintings for Belmont. And I'm going to give you some insight onto some of those paintings today. But I thought today, at least at the beginning here, let's talk about how I got introduced to Belmont myself. So let's start the slideshow. Okay, so here's our introductory slide, and you can see me working on the right there, and then Gary working on the left, and Gary in the middle as well. And so, of course, it's very much about Gary Melcher's. Just about everything we will talk about today revolves around Gary Melcher's. So let's jump on to the next slide. So my introduction to Belmont and Gary Melcher's happened about 35 years ago or close to it. I moved to Fredericksburg in the late 80s to work in Washington, D.C. I was very fortunate to get a full-time job for a temporary conservation treatment that lasted a year. And that treatment was for the very large fresco painting, which is at the top of the U.S. Capitol dome. It's actually inside. It's a painting by Constantino Brumidi. The title is The Apotheosis of George Washington. This was just a fantastic project. You see a little newspaper clipping on the right here. That project was headed up by Bernard Rabin, who was 72 at the time. And this was essentially what he called his swan song in conservation. He was very close to retirement age. He took this on as kind of a last hurrah. And just on the other side of that, this was my first professional job. So it was kind of an interesting way that happened. To be honest, he hired me to be a donkey. I was young and strong, and I could run up the side of scaffoldings pretty easily and carry a bucket in one hand at the same time. And I just finished my conservation education, my school training, and I hadn't really been in the business for very long. But this was a fantastic project, lasted for about a year. So that's why I was in Fredericksburg. But being a lover of history and art, I found the Belmont, the Gary Melcher's house, very quickly, and I loved this place. It's just such a beautiful site itself, historic house. And of course, the connection with great American art and Gary Melcher's was just a heady mix for me. So I loved this place. Next slide, please. Right after the Capitol project, I moved on to the Library of Congress. This is directly across the street. We're specifically talking about the Jefferson building of the Library of Congress. And this is just a couple of years after the Capitol project. The Library of Congress building started a 5 or 6 year process of total renovation from floor to ceiling, foundation, wiring, plumbing, everything. And art was just a part of that. If you've never been in the Jefferson building, please do go. It is one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever been in. The image on the far left, that is the entrance hall, which is probably the most heavily decorated part of the building. It was open to the public in 1893, I believe it is. And it's essentially a who's who of American artists at that time. Not everybody is included, but there's a good 20, 25 artists that were very well known as American artists and painters at that time, and Gary Melcher's was one of those artists. His artwork is in the northwestern wing of the building, and it's 2 large lunette paintings. You can see at the top right, there's a very blurry photograph of the long hall showing one of the mural paintings above the doors there, and the other one would be behind your head in this photograph. You can see an image of Gary Melcher's at the bottom here working on a similar mural. And I like this picture just because it gives you a sense of space. I mean, imagine as a painter covering that kind of square footage. It's you have to be well trained and really know what you're doing to do that kind of work. Next slide, please. So here's some images of the job that is at the top left and then going around clockwise. These 4 images kind of shows you the process of actually working on site. We had all this scaffold work that we had to climb up and down all the time. You see a couple of my conservation friends actually doing the cleaning. And then at the lower right, you see an image that shows you the difference in the cleaning. These paintings were incredibly dirty. Actually, the whole building was. And at this point, the ceiling and the trim next to the painting had already been repainted. So you really can see how strongly discolored and dirty these paintings were. So it was about this time in my work on these Gary Melcher's murals that I took the opportunity to contact Belmont and talk to the curator, Joanna Catron, and asked her if I could visit. So she said, yes, of course. And we had a very nice visit talking about Gary Melcher's and the paintings at the Library of Congress. And very quickly, we formed a working relationship that has lasted over 30 years. Next. So here's the majority of the paintings I've worked on at the library, Belmont, Melcher's home and studio. They're not all Melcher's paintings. Essentially, all the paintings on the right and down the center are Melcher's paintings. And then the paintings on the far right are paintings that are in the collection of Belmont and the Melcher's home. There's probably another half a dozen or so that aren't in this image. I created this image a few years ago for a different presentation, so I've just kept it. And here I'm just showing you kind of the relative size of these paintings. You can see that there's quite a difference in the size and the format of all of these paintings. But it gives you some idea of the number of paintings that I've worked on in the 30 years I've been working with Joanna and Belmont. Next, please. Melchers is a really interesting artist to know and understand. Today, I would say that his notoriety is not quite as high as some other American painters from the same time. But in his own day, he was top of the top. He was at the center of everything. He was a leader in the field. He headed up many different artist organizations. He was known by everybody. Everybody corresponded with him. He is really like the center of a wheel of all the artistic activity in American painting during his lifespan. And his artwork really shows all the diversity that was happening during his lifetime. He started out in one style that he largely adopted while going to school in Germany, but then he very quickly shifted to Impressionism, a brand new style that was born in France during his lifetime. And then on top of that, he incorporated realism and many other facets of art history that were going on at the time. And then was a very notable mural painter, which was a very big movement in the late 19th century in America. So he was very much a central figure. He was extremely well trained. He knew his materials very well. And me as a painting conservator and an art historian, it's wonderful to be able to study someone so in depth and really understand him and his work, and by extension, know American painting. Next. And along those lines, one of the things I love about Belmont that you can't find hardly anywhere else is that the materials have been preserved. His studio materials, his working materials and tools have by and large been preserved from his lifetime. I have studied the history of paint from prehistoric times to modern times, and it's extremely hard to find this kind of a treasure chest of actual materials that an artist has used being preserved. And I come back to this again and again. It's just really fascinating. Next. So to kind of put Belmont in a nutshell for me, three things are going on here, three main categories that you can't find hardly anywhere else. And that is, we have a beautiful historic house with a great collection, a collection that Gary and Corinne Melcher put together through their lifetime and preserved for us to see. The house itself, of course, is much older. It's been there long before they found it. So you have all of that history rolled into a great historic house and park. On top of that, you have a historic artist studio. Like I just said, his materials are preserved, not only his materials, but the actual space, the studio itself that he had designed and built is all preserved. And you just can't get this kind of a feeling, experience almost any place else. And on top of that, it's actually an art museum. It has the galleries to display Gary's art and other associated art very clearly and well, like you would see in any first-rate art museum. So you have all of these three things going on at the same time at Belmont. Next, please. So now I'll talk about some of the treatments. Obviously, I can't talk about them all. There's much too many, and I won't talk about all of them in detail either. I'm just picking out different aspects here and there. But the thing I have to say up front is that this work just would not have been possible without the relationship I have with Joanna Catron. As a conservator, I make a lot of decisions. Of course, I bring my knowledge to the situation, but a lot of decisions have to be made, and I can't make those independently. Joanna, being the great art historian she is, knowing Gary so well, we have to work as a team to do the correct things for the artwork, because that is the goal. The goal is to preserve the artwork and the history that goes along with it. And so on every one of these treatments, every step, Joanna and I have conferred to check each other to make sure that we're doing the proper thing in each situation. Next, please. I'm not going to talk about these two treatments today, and that is because these two treatments are the ones that I covered in the previous presentation. So by all means, go to the YouTube channel or to the Facebook page for Belmont and enjoy these two presentations and the details I bring up there. Next, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 5 or 6 Melchers paintings. I'm kind of going from earliest to latest here for no other particular reason than it gives it a little bit of continuity. This painting is one of the least Melchers-like paintings that I treated. It's definitely by Melchers. It's probably late 19th century. I don't know the date of it. I'm not certain that any of us really clearly know the date of it, but I find it really intriguing. It was intriguing to work on, and it remains very intriguing to me. So this is a painting that is clearly a copy of a painting by Botticelli. So Botticelli is one of the best known Italian Renaissance, early Italian Renaissance painters, and he's particularly well known for doing large paintings and for murals. And so it's not surprising that Gary would copy a painting by a great old master. This is something it's a very common teaching education tool for painters, especially in the past, to copy established, well-known artwork so that they can absorb the lessons from that sort of thing. So when I was presented with this painting, it was in pretty poor condition, to tell you the truth, very dirty, a lot of cracking, some loss. The stage that you're seeing in the painting is here. I've already cleaned it, but and I've started filling the losses, that is bringing them up to the level of the original paint before I apply my paint. So as you're looking at this image on the right side, you'll see a lot of dark spots in that light background. Those are all losses. So that gives you some indication of some of the paint loss that I was dealing with here. And ultimately, I fixed all that and had it looking right. But it intrigued me from the very beginning, some oddities here. The most obvious one is at the lower left. There's this big rectangular patch with nothing in it. And that made absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. What the heck is going on there? And there's actually another one at the lower left corner, lower right corner, and the lower left side, and also through the head of one of the main figures. There's a big long area with no information in it. It's not filled out. And so, of course, when I looked up the original painting, it becomes clear those are losses in the original painting. The painting now resides at the Louvre. You see it very prominently on one of the main corridors there, and you can kind of see it in relation to the people that are squatting in front of it here in this image. But you can see in the image, there are big losses. So why are there losses? Well, this was originally a wall painting, a fresco painting that was painted in a house in Florence, Italy. And oddly enough, it was rediscovered in 1873. It had been painted over. People had forgotten it was there. And it was rediscovered probably during a renovation or something of the house. And so this painting and another one that was paired with it were saved. They were removed from the wall in the house, and they were actually put onto a canvas. And eventually the Louvre acquired them. I'm not quite clear on the history there. But that kind of clues me into the fact that this was probably a very big deal when these paintings were found. You can see that they were discovered in 1873. And that's about the time that Gary Melchers was going to Germany to continue his art education. Gary, as far as I know, went to Paris in 1880 and spent several years there. So he would have had the opportunity to go to the Louvre and copy this painting, a painting that would have been very famous at that time because of its rediscovery. Next,
Gary,
please. Yes.
Gary, may I ask a question?
Certainly.
How do you remove a fresco from a wall?
I knew you were going to ask that, Michelle. So I will mess with you and say very carefully. There are a couple different ways to remove it, and none of them are pretty. But in many instances, it has to be done because the wall, a painting on a wall is only as healthy as the wall is. So if the wall is going to be demolished or has been severely damaged, then you have to remove the painting. How about if we return back to that question later, because it can get kind of detailed. We have a lot of things to cover here. But I will just say, it's not an uncommon practice, especially in the past, to remove fresco paintings from their walls. But it's not something you undertake lightly. So, okay, next slide, please. Okay, so that was a large scale painting. This is a very small scale painting. This painting is about 1 foot across, maybe 16 inches. And it represents actually several paintings that I've worked on for Belmont Melchers Museum. And I'll ask everybody just a rhetorical question. You see the before image on the upper left and the after treatment image on the upper right. What's the difference between those two pictures? The one most obvious difference. And I'll give you just a second to think about it. So while you're thinking about that, I want to say that this is probably a study. And so an artist does a study to prepare for a larger painting, which may or may not ever happen. But the study is not intended to be a finished artwork. It's an artwork, if you even want to call it an artwork, it's actually more like a tool. The artist has an idea. They may do several drawings on site where something's happening or in their imagination. They put this information together and they work towards doing a finished painting. So what we see here is a very quick sketch, I would call it, an oil paint. There's a very loose drawing underneath it. So this is where Melchers is kind of figuring out his idea of what a finished painting might look like. So this is definitely a sketch. It's not a finished painting. So my rhetorical question, what's the difference between these two paintings? Well, there was a little dirt on it. There was a little of this, a little of that. But the real problem here is that the painting as it was presented to me is no longer on a stretcher. It was originally a stretched canvas on a wooden stretcher frame. For whatever reason, Gary removed the stretcher, probably to reuse it for another canvas. And there's probably a dozen paintings like this in the collection at Belmont. I've treated at least 4 of them like this. And so this painting has lived off of the stretcher for a very long time. For a stretched canvas painting to stay healthy, it needs to be stretched like a trampoline, basically. Not necessarily very tight, but it still needs to be stretched. And it's really the best way to present the painting, to put it on the wall. So the operation here was to put it back on a stretcher. So at the lower left, you see the back of the painting as it existed, which is actually a piece of shirt cardboard that the painting was kind of loosely wrapped around. So we removed that, we reshaped the painting, we reestablished the tacking edges, and we attach it back onto a new stretcher. So that's what you're seeing at the lower right. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a portrait of Gary's mother that he made around 1900. And the 2 images that you see at the top here, this is the same painting on the same day, just in a different lighting situation. So at the upper left, we see the painting in normal light. Normal light would be essentially the way you would ordinarily see the painting with gallery light or whatnot. It's evenly lit, and it doesn't look too bad. It's a little on the gray side, maybe. I can see that it's probably a little dirty, but other than that, it really doesn't show that much. But on the right, you see the painting in raking light, where we've taken all the lights and put them on the extreme left, and the light rakes across the surface, and it accentuates texture differences, planar differences. So right off the bat, at the top edge of the painting, you see what we call edge draws. These are distortions in the canvas that have developed over time. And if you leave it that way, it will eventually make the paint pop off. So this is a situation where we really need to correct that. The other thing that's a little bit harder to see is right at her elbow in the lower center of the painting, there's a tear. So you see a detail of that tear at the bottom of the screen. On the left side, you see the front of the painting, and on the right side, you see the back of the painting. Now this tear is really interesting to me for a couple of reasons. One is that when a canvas painting tears, a young canvas painting, you get a lot of distortion. So you can see in this small detail, there's a lot of distortion there. The edges of that tear are like Pringles potato chips. They are very wavy, and there's other little tears associated, that sort of thing. If you get a tear in an old canvas painting, it tears very cleanly and right at a right angle. So you get a very nice edge to put back together when you go to repair it. But in a situation like this, where the tear is very distorted, you have to do a lot of work to get it lined up again and to reduce the distortions before you repair it. The lower right image, this is almost without doubt a repair that Gary himself did. And he was not a painting conservator. Artists do not necessarily make good restorers. You really have to think about paintings or artwork in a different way to be a good art conservator. Artists tend to just fix things very quickly and with at least little effort as possible. And he didn't really do a very good job here. These little paper dots And I used to know what these are, and it escapes me now. They have adhesive on one side, and I think it's something that you used to be able to buy a long time ago, decades ago, to, I can't remember, repair paper tears or something like that. I'm not really even quite certain what these were used for. And you can see there's a little paint or a little glue or something kind of slopped on there. But this was not an effective way to repair the tear. On the other hand, having said that, this painting survived 100 years before I treated it. So that's all to the credit of Gary Melchers himself liking this painting and preserving it the way he did to get it to me. Next slide, please. So here we see the process that I went through to repair that tear. And it looks a little bit like a musical instrument, but that's not what it is. It's this is the back side of the painting, and I've made a very small strainer. You can see the wooden strainer there. And on that, I have orchestrated these long pulls. And these long pulls are adhered to the edge of the tear, and they work across each other. So I'm pulling the tear together. I'm pulling the tear together, and I'm also reducing that wavy distortion, making it flat. So this is kind of a long, drawn-out process. You can see it's rather intricate, but it's about the only way that you're going to effectively pull that tear together and make it look right. So you see the image at the lower right, that's from the front at the same time as the upper image. And the white that you're seeing there is these little fabric pulls that I've installed. But you can see in this image how straight the tear is now. That the wavy distortion is gone. Everything's lined up as well as it's going to. The fact that it doesn't join up is largely because the fact that the tear happened so long ago that, locally speaking, the canvas has shrunk. It has backed away from each other. So I can't reestablish that. I can't pull the canvas all the way back together. So ultimately, I filled it in painted this spot. Next slide. So here you have a before and after, and at the these upper images, these are both raking images. So you really get a feeling for how the tear was repaired, which you can see in the details at the bottom. But also you can see how the edge draws at the top were also reduced and taken out of the painting to get it back to what it should be to keep it a healthy painting. Next, please. Okay, so we move on to St. George's Church, probably one of the best known paintings by Gary. It was really a joy to work on this painting because it is a beautiful painting, but it was also a very difficult painting for me to work on. I won't go into a lot of the detail on this, but what I wanted to show you here was dealing with the materials that the artist gives you. So here we have a beautiful canvas painting. It's probably, 2.5 feet on a side, something like that. So it's not small, but not terribly big. But the problems here are really about the way it was painted and the materials it was constructed from. So the canvas here is very thin. It's one of the most lightweight canvases I've seen for a painting of this size. It is so lightweight, in fact, with so relatively little paint on it, that light shines right through it. And that's what I'm showing you on the far upper right here, where I've actually put lights behind the painting. And you are seeing the light passing through the thin canvas, only obstructed by the stretcher bar that's across the middle, but also the dots of paint, that little dabs of paint that Gary has put on. At the on the lower left, you see a little more of a detail of one of the corners, and you will notice the small detail that the wooden framework that you're seeing here is a strainer. That is, it is a fixed structure. You cannot expand it. It is not a stretcher. A stretcher is expandable. And that will come into play in just a minute. At the lower right, you see a close-up detail of the paint. This is of the sky up where the foliage of the trees overlaps the blue sky. One, the kind of dull cream-looking colors, that's actually the preparation, the gesso of the painting. So you're seeing a lot of area that has no design paint on it. That's just the gesso. That suggests how thin this paint is. But the paint that Gary did apply, he applies rather thickly. You can see some of the big blobs of paint here. So over time, all these materials work against each other. You have canvas and ground and paint. These are all materials that are quite different, and fluctuating through temperature and humidity causes these materials to expand and contract, but they expand and contract in a different way because they are made out of different materials. But since they are stuck together, causes a lot of stress between those materials. The way the painting relieves stress is by cracking. So let's say you have an oil painting that's this exact same age, made exactly the same way, but you put it in a magical room where the temperature and humidity does not change. It has never changed in 100 years. The painting wouldn't have any cracks in it because the stress has not been introduced by environmental change. So we have a painting in the real world like most paintings, and so of course it has cracks. So in the center area, you'll see a little blue passage, and the lower part of that passage in the center there, you see some cracks develop. The cracks develop first down through the paint, but then over time, as this cycling of temperature and humidity continue, that piece of that island of paint starts curling up on the edges. And as it curls up, it cleaves, it separates from the layers underneath the canvas and the gesso. And eventually it curls up so much and splits off so to the degree that it actually pops off. So just below that, you actually see some naked canvas just in a very small spot where the flake has popped off altogether. So this is the problem across the whole painting. So my job was to re-adhere loose paint, try to relax those paint flakes flat again to the extent possible, but also to redo the structure of the painting so it could support all of this. The canvas is very thin, so it doesn't hold the paint very well, these paint distortions very well. And the stretcher, the current strainer cannot be expanded. So you can't make the canvas tight enough to keep it healthy. So on to the next slide, please. So here you see the remedy for that. At the upper left, you see that I have adhered the original canvas to a second piece of fabric, and I've replaced the strainer with a good quality stretcher. So all of this was very intricate work and very invasive work that changes the structure of the painting, but with the goal to keep it healthy for a long time. This is not something you undertake lightly. It's you will see in some other cases. Well, the previous painting of Mrs. Melchers, many people would have lined that painting. Many restorers would have. I chose not to because I wanted to repair that tear locally without involving the rest of the painting. Because in restoration, the more materials that you put into a painting in restoration, the more things that can go wrong in the future. So in this case, I felt like a lining was necessary. In the previous case with the tear, I was hoping that a local tear repair would be good enough. And then we move to the central image at the top. You can see how dirty the painting was. I've cleaned the far left-hand side of it. So you can really see how dramatic the cleaning was in this case. And at the lower right, you see the finished product. Next, please. Okay, this is by far one of my favorite paintings in the collection. It's rather large. It's probably 3.5 feet tall, something like that. And I just think it's a beautiful painting. But one of the things I really like about it is reading into it, I have to say, from what I know about Gary, was that he was about 70 years old when he painted this painting. This was at the end of his career. I think he only lived another 2 or 3 years. He was probably a little bit past the point of caring what other people thought about his paintings. He was painting for himself in this case. So what does he do? He chooses beautiful flowers, and he chooses a young woman that he knew very well, a woman that lived right next door to the property. You can see her house at the top here that's preserved to this day. I think it has actually become part of the property at Belmont, but that has only changed in the last few years. And that was the home of the Root family. And this is Fannie Root. She was a teenager when Gary painted this painting. So I think this is a very forthright and truthful kind of portrait of Fannie, where this is someone he knows. He doesn't feel like he needs to flatter her. And she's just somewhat a personality that he feels comfortable with. So once again, I think he's created a painting for himself of subjects that he likes. And I just think that adds a certain quality to this painting that is really worth appreciating. The detail at the right is just interesting from a conservation standpoint, in that earlier on we had the portrait of Mrs. Melchers, which clearly had a tear in it from early on. And we saw that Gary had repaired that. The repair was not very good, and the painting had not aged very well. And so that tear had not aged very well. So clearly I needed to intercede there to make that look right. In this case, we have a damage in the middle of this painting, in the middle of this detail, where a hole probably about the size of a quarter was punched through the painting. A patch was applied to the back, and the paint here looks very clearly to me that Gary probably retouched this painting himself. In this case, the repair was very effective. It works very well. Even though I can find this damage, I know what it is, I don't see any reason to repair it. It looks good, and most people would not even notice that there had been a damage to it. Next, please. This is a Cautionary Tale. This is a beautiful painting. I really like this. It's late in Gary's career. A lot of times people look at Gary Melcher's paintings over his long career and they don't see a lot of change. They kind of see an artist that found what they wanted to do early and just continued that their whole life. My insight from seeing so many of the paintings up close is that that is not the case. Gary continued to experiment. He continued to do many changes over his career. And one of the things that I progressively see through his paintings is moving from a glossier paint finish to a more matte finish. This painting is quite matte, and it's not glossy at all. But the point is here is that he did something different to make the painting more matte. It is an oil painting, just like so many of the other paintings. But what's different is the gesso, the preparation, that white featureless paint that he put on before the design paint is water soluble. Most of the other grounds, every other ground on a painting that I have seen of his is not water soluble. It's an oil ground. The binder in its oil is not sensitive to water. But in this case, it is sensitive to water. Water quickly damages this painting. And I bring that up because all of the other Gary Melcher's paintings you've seen, almost without fail, were cleaned with water. They're oil paintings, and I could safely clean them with water with a few other things added that would make it an effective cleaning. In this case, if I tried the same thing, water would very quickly damage this painting. Next, please. Okay, now we're moving on to paintings that are not by Gary. This is one of the first paintings one of the early paintings I worked for, repaired for Belmont. And this is a painting of Corinne. Michelle, which one is Corinne? I have to say, I don't remember.
She is on the left.
She's on the left.
Mm-hmm.
In this image.
And her brother Leonard is on the right and is holding the peacock feather.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Then I won't stumble through this. I know now what's going on. So I won't go through all the steps here. The painting was quite dirty, as you can see from the cleaning image at the lower center. But there are some small tears here and there. You see some small tears in the background at the top and in the red furniture at the far left. But you also see this large loss in the shoulder of Leonard. And every artwork is kind of a puzzle. I think it's one of the fun aspects of my job is to figure out why things look the way they do. One, I'm trying to diagnose conservation problems. You have to diagnose them to treat them properly. But also it's just kind of interesting to what has happened to this painting. We think about artwork having a very boring life. It's made, it's displayed, nothing changes. Well, I can tell you things change all the time for any number of different reasons. So here I was looking at the painting and like, yes, there are other damages on this painting, but there's nothing like this paint loss in the shoulder of the figure. And you see a detail of it at top center. So in investigating this painting, I turned it over. The back often tells us a lot about what's going on in the painting. And on the canvas, you see a stain that is the exact shape of this paint loss on the front of the painting. And not only that, if you look very closely, you see dirt. You see an incrustation of dirt or mud on the back. So almost without doubt, this was an insect nest. Maybe mud daubers would be the most likely clue. That is what caused this loss. The dirt itself acts like a sponge. And we talked earlier about the changes of temperature and humidity. If you have something on the back of the painting that is holding humidity in a spot, it's going to affect the paint. And that's what caused this paint loss. Ultimately, I consolidated the loose paint around the edges, filled it, and in painted it to the point where it's not obvious that the painting is damaged. And that's always the goal. The goal isn't to make the painting whole again as if these damages never happened. The damages exist. They will always exist. We just don't want our viewers to be distracted by them. So the restoration I do is just to the point where your casual observer wouldn't realize that there was a damage in the first place. Next. Okay, so this is a lovely little painting. I think it's about 12 inches tall, maybe something like that. by George Hitchcock, one of the artist friends of Gary Melchers. And here you have a very straightforward cleaning. Hitchcock is known for these beautiful paintings of tulips from Holland. And we have a great example here. So we're moving from left to right. Left is the way I found the painting, the original state of it. In the center, you have the cleaning. You can see it around the edges. You can see I'm starting to clean into the painting. And then the last painting is the fully cleaned painting, pretty much without any other problems. I don't think I retouched a single thing on this painting. It's in such good shape. One of the things I point out here, other than the fact that this is what 100 years of dirt and grime looks like on a painting, is I'm often asked, how do I know where I'm going? How do I know a painting is dirty? Well, of course I can do cleaning tests, and I always do those along the edges and things to ascertain, one, is a painting dirty, but also can I clean it? Because that's an open question more times than not. But I'll point out something on the far left image. This is the painting untouched the way I received it. I took it out of the frame, and the first thing I'm presented with is that light edge around the frame, around the painting. That's the area that was protected by the frame. That's the way the painting pretty closely looked when it was originally painted. So here's a clue right off the bat to me. It shows me what I'm looking for. How's the painting changed? What am I trying to do to get it back to what that edge looks like? So that's just a little insight about how I work. Next, please. This is a really interesting painting along the same lines. This is not a finished painting. This is very much like A Man at the Capstan, the second painting that we looked at by Melchers. This is again by an artist friend of Melchers, Walter Mcewen. A lot of these artist friends visited Gary in Falmouth at Belmont, and they went to the studio and they painted, because that's what painters do. And this is a man, James Rouser, who was a local personality, probably worked at Belmont, and he modeled for Gary and Walter both that day. So here we have a painting on the left, the way it was presented to me. It's very dirty. But the problem here is a couple of things. One is that the dirt layer across the painting is not even. If you look closely, you will see kind of a rectangular shape imposed on the painting. It's rather large. You can especially see it on the lower right-hand side and across the bottom of the painting. It's slightly skewed. That's where something laid on top of this painting and protected it from grime for a long time. And so you have this darker shadow of dirt around the edges. So when I have an uneven dirt layer, it presents a cleaning problem. Oftentimes, it doesn't clean the same in one area as it does in the other. The other thing is I have a dichotomy of materials. The gesso, that white gesso ground application, is formulated to be absorbent. That's kind of part of its job, is to be absorbent, so that when the artist puts the design paint on, it is well attached to the ground layer and makes a solid paint. The design layer paint itself is much more slick, and especially after you do several layers of it, it's much less porous. So when you have a dirt layer on something that has such different areas on it, the dirt can easily be removed from the painted area, but that gesso area is much harder to remove the grime from evenly. So the trick is to try to evenly clean the painting. But there was yet one more complication, and that was the inscription in the lower left is in pencil. As I said earlier, a lot of my cleaning to remove dust and grime, dirt and grime, is water-based cleaning. If I cleaned the pencil inscription with water, it would take it right out. So I had to be very careful with any cleaning system in this lower corner, and I had to try to evenly clean the painting so it didn't look out of balance. I think I did a relatively good job with this. You can see it on the right. In this case, we didn't try to get rid of all the problems. There were scratches, there were little dents, there were little problems, because it's a 100-year-old painting that's been kind of bouncing around the studio for a long time during Gary's life, and then also in the studio after the fact. So there was no reason to try to make this look like a pristine painting. It's a study. It's not meant to look like a finished artwork. And I think we're fairly successful about making this painting presentable. Next, please. Okay, so this is a fun painting to end my talk on. There's just this slide and one more. And the painting here, it's a beautiful painting. It's about 400 years old. It's one of the paintings that Gary and Corinne collected during their time in Europe, most likely. It has a very nice frame on it. I've learned a lot about 17th century Dutch painting since I've come to the North Carolina Museum of Art. I can tell you that this is a beautifully painted work. You can see in the central image there, even as dirty as this painting was, and it's a lot of yellowed varnish is what we're looking at on the surface here. Just look at the eyes of this figure. It's really beautifully done. So here you see on the left the way I received it, and on the right the way it finished. Okay, so you see, like so many of the paintings we looked at today, it's a cleaning issue, right? It's removing dirty varnish to get to this beautiful painting underneath. Well, that doesn't tell the whole story, because you have to see what the painting looked like between these two stages. So next, Adam. This is the actual state of the painting. What I mean by actual state is after I've removed everything that is old restoration, this painting had been restored at least twice, if not 3 times before it came to me. I try to remove all of that to get back to the original painting as much as possible. And what do we see? We see kind of a mess. There's a lot of paint loss here. There are tears. There's all sorts of things going on. The lower left-hand corner of the painting is almost totally missing. The canvas is there, but there's almost no paint left in that area. So something really dramatic happened to this painting. I'm guessing from the extent of the damage that this went through some serious trauma. Maybe there was a fire. Maybe that this painting was thrown out at some point and then reclaimed. Who knows what the story is with this painting? But the point is, it was very dramatically damaged. Next slide, please. So here's the painting again, once again, before I treated it and after I treated it. So I want the audience to use their powers of deduction to think about what's different between these two paintings. Now we know that yes, I cleaned it, it looks better. You know that difference, but there's one little difference I'm looking for. It's not so small, but there's a little difference. You can see something in the finished product that you can't see in the previous painting. And I'll let you think about that, and you're welcome to put it in the chat, or the Q&A. Chat would probably be a better choice in this case. And I'll talk again for just a few minutes while you're thinking about that. Once again, this is a beautiful painting. One of the things I really like about it is, of course, that what we call a stone mill collar. That's a certain kind of fashion that was very popular during this time in Europe, especially in the Netherlands. It's just very nicely rendered. You get this sense of the light striking it on the front, but also the transparency where it goes over the shoulder of the figure. The cap on the woman's head is beautifully rendered and made. And this is largely, especially the backside, is lace, handmade lace. And on the front, what we call the stomacher of the figure is a lot of decoration. And in this case, that decoration, it's painted with regular paint, earth tones, ochre and browns and blacks and things like that. But what it's representing is gold and silver thread, literal thread that's made out of gold and silver. All these aspects in this painting point to the fact that this is a very rich person. This is a status painting, showing you just how important and well off this person is. So, okay, did anybody notice a difference between these two paintings? Michelle, what do you think?
So we have someone chimed in and commented on the reflection on her face.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, that's definitely there. Anything else? Okay, well, you missed it. Maybe some of you were thinking about it and you just didn't speak up. But if you look in the after treatment image, the one in the center, if you look at the left edge, you will see a white thing there. You cannot see in the previous paint before I treated it. So what does that look like? It looks a whole lot like the back corner of the stone mill collar on the woman. And in fact, that's what it is. And if you look even closer, it's hard to see in this image, just below that white blocky thing, there's a little sloping dark thing, which is the shoulder of another person. So clearly, this was a bigger painting at one time. We really have no idea how big it was or what else it included, but we can be pretty certain that it included at least one other figure. So that's what's one of the interesting mysteries here. I'm sorry, could you advance one more time? One of the open mysteries here is what had this painting look like before it was damaged? We will probably never know unless we find some other evidence, like a full drawing of this painting by the artist or something like that. Of course, we don't even know who the artist is in this case. But in my little diagram here that I very quickly drew, you see the existing painting in a red outline. And then conjecturally, it had yet one more figure, which could be the woman's husband. And then it could be even larger than that, and it could have included the children. Group paintings are very common in this era. So you might have, 5, 10, 12 figures side by side, all women, all men, a mixed group. There were a lot of guilds and special interest groups that had their group portraits done. So this could have been just about anything. One other little clue that came through that's not clear in this image is that background just above the woman's head is clearly stone architecture of some kind, maybe the side or the interior of a church. So there is evidence here that art historian could use to try to narrow down who this is and what this larger image might have been. But we're really left with a mystery. Clearly, someone valued this portrait for a painting to be so damaged to save this one part, this one portrait. Clearly, this woman was important to somebody. But for us, it's a beautifully painted painting and a mystery, which makes it more fun. So that's the end of my presentation today, and I'm happy to answer questions.
All right, so while our participants are formulating their questions, I have a few things.
Sure.
So in terms of Gary Melcher's technique and materials,
Sure.
is there anything that remained constant throughout his career?
The one constant I would say, almost without fail, he always used high quality materials. And I don't say that lightly, because the art history is full of bad materials and materials where the artist was making the best choice that they knew, but the materials were poorly made without them knowing that. When you get into the area of Gary Melcher's and really right into our own era, there is a wide range of materials to choose from. And intentionally, a lot of art material makers are making student grade art materials that are second rate. The pigments aren't as good, the binders aren't as good. They're made less expensively on purpose so that the manufacturer doesn't put as much money into them, but also the person buying them doesn't invest so much. But they are clearly second rate to top rate materials that a fine artist would want to use. Gary Melcher's knew his materials very well. Not only I can tell that from the paintings themselves, how well they have aged and hung together, but also the materials that have been preserved in his studio. You can see the manufacturers, you can see the quality of the things that he was buying. So that would be the most obvious indicator to me.
That's interesting. So with your knowledge of his work, if someone came to you with two paintings that to the untrained eye looked similar, and they asked you which one is Gary's, what would you look for?
That's a really interesting question. For one, I'll tell you just generically, if you have an unattributed painting and you're trying to attribute it to a specific artist, it is a very long road, and it's a very difficult thing to do. It's very easy to say what it's not, and it's not by a certain person, because a lot of times you can quantify a known artist's work because there are so many other examples to compare it to. And in Melcher's case, there are a lot of examples. He's a known artist. Joanna has done fantastic work in knowing the artist and knowing how he painted, when he painted, what subjects he painted, all those sort of things. And those are all things that you would call on to try to attribute a painting that you thought might be by Gary Melcher's. But the fact is that at the time he was painting, there are untold numbers of people that were painting in a very similar way, using exactly the same materials. So the reality is it can be very hard to say without any doubt that a painting is by a particular person or by Gary Melcher.
So it sounds like it would be more of a curator type question as opposed to a conservator type question.
It largely is. Conservators, especially what we call technical art history analysis that we can do on artworks, we can narrow things down dramatically. And every once in a while, you find a smoking gun. So just within Gary's lifetime, pigments changed fairly dramatically. So pigments that he used in his early career, he would not across the board. Some of them changed, so he would have used different pigments at the end of his career. At certain times, you can pick those out. For instance, one of the paintings I treated that I think it's from about 1920, 1925, it's called Tonsorial Parlor. It's a man getting a shave. In that painting, Gary clearly used two different white pigments. He used lead white and he used zinc white. And I know that because you can look at the painting under ultraviolet light, and the zinc white looks very different under ultraviolet light. You can recognize that pigment very quickly. Zinc white was really not available to artists before 1900. So here you have a way that you can generally date the painting just by the pigment that was used in it. So if you had a painting that you knew was a later Gary Melchers and it didn't have zinc white in it, that wouldn't tell you for a fact that Melchers painted it or not, but it would make you suspicious if it was a Melchers painting.
So in Tonsorial Parlor, do you think he was using up some of the old white paint and then used it all up and then went to the newer?
It could have been just that, but you know, Gary was a fine-tuned instrument. He would have seen the different aspects of zinc white compared to lead white. Just the fact that it's white doesn't mean it's the same. They are different colors. They are different materials. He would have seen that himself. They probably handled differently out of the tube. So he probably would have used that in his technique, the way he laid the paint on. They would have felt different. So those were all aspects that he would have matched to what he was trying to do.
Interesting. All right, so Ryan asks, are the edges of the last painting cut in a way that it could indicate it was part of a larger painting?
Yes and no. I don't recall that we ever x-rayed that painting. The reason I bring that up is that when you stretch a canvas, when you make a stretch canvas painting, the edge within 2 or 3 inches of where it's connected to the stretcher, the weave of the fabric actually changes when you stretch it. We call it cusping. So it kind of looks like a spider web. It has these little arching threads, distortion along the edge, and that dissipates as you go into the center of the painting. And it only lasts for 2 or 3 inches. That's really obviously recognizable. So by the time you get to the middle of painting, it's just rectilinear crossing of threads. So I have seen paintings and I have diagnosed other paintings where I could see that it was cut down because on one edge or more, you could see the cusping. You could see where it had originally been stretched, but one edge would have no cusping on it whatsoever. And that would suggest that it had been cut off at some point. And you may even see that in the composition of the painting. It just looks unbalanced. It looks truncated in some way. You know, it's a portrait of a figure and the arm's no longer there. It just ends. And that just looks right. Excuse me, looks wrong. The figure is a little bit off center. That might suggest that something's been cut off. In the case of this particular painting, I did not do that kind of analytical work on it to show whether the existing painting had an original edge on it or not. As I remember, it had been through so many restorations that it was a very confused situation. As a matter of fact, the front of the painting itself on the right-hand side, behind the figure, the edge that you might think could have been original, it actually had tack holes through the painting. And that you only do that in a restoration situation where you've lost the original edge and you need to connect it to the stretcher in some quick and dirty way. And so that suggests to me right there that there's so much monkeying around in old restorations that it might be very hard to ascertain what the original edge was, if or when.
All right, so Lori asks, what was your favorite painting to work on?
Oh, they're all my favorites, Lori. You know that.
Good answer.
I can't pick a favorite. Color is just one of my all-time favorite paintings. I've run across people that did not feel that way about that painting, but I think it's definitely one of the nicest paintings I've worked on by Melchers. So I'm going to stick with that choice because clearly they're all good. They're all interesting. St. George's Church is a beautiful painting, but it was difficult. It stretched my ability. So I can't say that I really enjoyed working on it, but I was very pleased with it by the end. So a lot of the paintings kind of fall into that category. Oh, and I'll add to that, the capstan, the small painting that was off the stretcher. I've treated two other ones recently that were in the same kind of situation. And one of those paintings was two young girls standing on a beach, which I know is a popular painting for your visitors because it's on the postcards. And I think Joanna even told me that it's a popular image. But the fact is, I don't think the painting had been exhibited in a very long time because it wasn't on a stretcher. And that just the idea of putting that painting back into a situation where it could be easily presented, I think that made me happy in that instance.
Edward asks, does the work done to restore a work of art become part of the official provenance of the work?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. As far as provenance, where's the painting been? I mean, that's essentially what provenance is. And so absolutely it's part of the provenance. It's interesting that in this technical art history vein, if I'm looking at a very old painting, and very old, 400, 300 years old, something like that, it's been restored 2 or 3 times. No one marks a calendar, but essentially about every 100 years an artwork gets restored. Every once in a while, sure, you do run across the 300-year-old painting that is untouched, and that's great to find because you know that no one's monkeyed with it. You're still seeing the original materials without any kind of confusion going on there. But for the most part, you see paintings that have been restored several times. And a lot of times those restorations help in the provenance. It helps to show that the painting did leave wherever it was owned and went someplace else and was changed by that process. I can't tell you how many people have brought me a painting and said, this painting's been in my family for 150 years and it has never been restored. It has never left my house. You know, generations have seen it in exactly the same place. And of course, when I examine it, it has been restored. Things have changed. It definitely left the house at some point. So, certainly conservation becomes part of the provenance. In the modern sense of the word, it should be a very important part of the provenance because a modern conservator that is following the ethics of the profession should be documenting everything thoroughly, what they're doing, written documentation, photographic documentation. And that documentation should be preserved by the institution that owns the artwork. So it becomes very much a part of the history of the artwork. So everybody understands what's been changed and when.
So it becomes part of the painting's file, so to speak.
Yeah, it's part of the painting story. I alluded earlier that people think artworks, the life of an artwork is very boring. It just sits there. But in fact, it goes through a lot of changes.
So Murray asks, did Gary make his own paints at the beginning of his career? Oh, I'm sorry, that's from MJ.
I doubt it seriously. It's unlikely because right at the beginning of his career, well, let's say by the time he went to art school in Germany and then in Paris, 2 paints were readily available from manufacturers. But it is right on the border because the generation before that would have made their own paints more times than not. I can't remember Vincent van Gogh's exact dates, but they're not dissimilar from Gary's. They're pretty close to the same age. And Van Gogh in particular, I know had paint made by particular art suppliers in Paris and put into tubes manually. They ground it the paint by hand and put it into tubes to sell to him. So that was essentially what was happening during that time. But certainly many artists up to Gary's time were either making the paint themselves or having their studio assistants make the paint for them. That's really right at that borderline where it could go either way. Gary is a very young person. He could have made his own paint. Part of his training in Germany could have, or maybe should have been making his own paint because and I'm sorry, I'm going to get way off track here maybe, because paint history is very interesting to me. And one of the things that I often talk about is that it's right at Gary's generation, maybe a little bit earlier, generation or two before that, where artists really lose contact with their materials. Because as soon as commercial manufacturers start making art materials for painters, the artists no longer need to know a lot of things about their pigments and how things work to make a good paint. They just rely on the suppliers to make them a good paint. And I can tell you plenty of stories where that was not true. That essentially, well, I said it before, there's student grade paint and there's professional grade paint. The manufacturers make all sorts of decisions that are about money, not necessarily about making the best paint. And so artists like Gary and generations after that, we're depending on the manufacturers to make a good product. We're kind of held prisoner by that.
So we do have a mortar and pestle in our collection. Would that be used in making paint?
It's very possible. It's very possible. I mean, there are a lot of tools and things in Gary's, preserved in Gary's collection there that could have been used in that way or could have been used in some other way. But certainly he could have been making some of his own paint. John Constable's a little bit earlier, maybe a generation early, at least 30, 40 years early. And I know for a fact Constable continued to carry paint materials out into the field. Like when he went out to do studies, he would make some paint on the spot. Some paints, especially at that time, even though they were starting to be made, they had been made by hand by paint sellers. Some paint didn't have a very good shelf life. So some particular pigments. So Constable chose to make some paints right on the spot. And the Royal Academy in England preserves some of that. A very little muller and a very little grinding stone to make a very small amount of paint on that Constable used.
Interesting. I want to be respectful of your time, Perry, but
Sure.
I do have just a few more questions.
Sure.
So you obviously have an art background.
Sure.
For those who are interested in this field or just want more information, when you moved on to your kind of graduate studies in conservation work, what types of classes were you taking?
I was taking a lot of science. You have to take chemistry. Physics is a good idea for insight into art materials. You have to have it. You have to understand the chemical nature of the things that you are working with. Physics absolutely comes into place. I was talking earlier about how a painting, a stretch canvas painting in this case, reacts to temperature and humidity changes. That's physics. That's engineering. That's mechanics. So these are all insights you really have to know to understand how artwork, paintings in my case, change over time, and if they are changing, how they're changing, how you deal with that. How do you slow down that change? How do you fix something once it's changed too far and you can no longer appreciate the artwork? Cleaning, for instance. Cleaning is very much about chemistry. Why can I remove dust and grime with water better than I can with a hydrocarbon solvent like naphtha or mineral spirits? That's about chemistry. Why would you remove a varnish with solvents like naphtha and acetone, things like that, but you can't remove it with water? That's chemistry. In fact, good chemists have figured out ways that you can remove varnish with water in certain instances. So these are all things that you have to understand, you have to have some insight into to really be an effective conservator. Of course, you need to know art history. Art history, knowing one era to the next in a particular kind of art. We're talking about pigments, how pigments change. Those kind of insights help you make the right decisions when you're trying to preserve an art. So there's a whole lot of background to be absorbed there. And of course, if you're going to work on a painting physically, you have to have good hand skills. You have to have good eye-hand coordination. You have to make good decisions. You have to solve puzzles. There's all sorts of preparation and experiences is absolutely necessary to making the right choices. Communication is another very important one. Like I've said, Joanna and I collaborated on every one of these treatments. I'm not an island. I need the input from a curator and art historian to help me make the right choices. To get there, what does a conservator have to do? In this day and time, you have to go to graduate school. You have to get a good undergraduate degree, an appropriate one. It can be in the arts, it can be in the sciences and other fields. And then you go on to graduate school to get very specific training. If you want to, you can also go even farther and get a PhD. That's still a relatively new thing. There aren't a lot of people in the field with a PhD. But to be a good professional bona fide conservator in this day and time, you really need to have that graduate.
Fascinating. Well, and unless someone else has a question, maybe we could just end things with, I'm still curious how you get a painting off a wall.
Okay.
Does it just peel off?
Yes, essentially, that's one way that you do it. Yes, there's two ways to do it, and I can't remember the exact Italian terms, unfortunately. But essentially, there are two ways to remove a fresco painting from the wall. Okay, so specifically in talking about the Botticelli, it is a fresco. And to remind everybody, a fresco is not an oil painting. An oil paint is a film that's applied to a surface. You might have a wood support, you might have a canvas support, you can even paint on a wall support, plaster support, bricks, whatever. But oil paint is a film that's on the surface. It essentially doesn't go into the support underneath it. You can attach to it very well, but doesn't go into it. Fresco is a very different animal because fresco is intentionally painted on wet plaster, wet line plaster. And the pigment that you're applying on it, it looks like paint, but it is just pigment and water. There's no binder in it. What binds it to the wall is that wet plaster. The paint literally goes into that wet plaster and becomes part of it. So when you go to remove the painting, you're removing plaster, you're removing part of the wall. And the wall, if it was made in a traditional sense, is made with layers. There might be several layers of plaster on top of brick or masonry or some of it. So when you go to remove that fresco, there are two ways to do it. Both include building up the front surface. You would adhere something to the face of the painting to hold it together. That might be fabric, it might be paper, you might have several layers on it, but that's integral to either one of these processes. The laborious way to do it, but maybe the safer way to do it, is to build up the front of the painting, like I said, to support it, and then to literally carve the wall off the back of it. And of course, that's a very big deal depending on how it's built, how that wall is built, how you take it apart without collapsing the building on your head or whatever else is going on. And during that process, you may glue paper or fabric to the face of the painting, but you almost essentially have to build a wall on the front of the painting to support it while you're taking it off the back. The other way, and obviously that process takes a lot of time. And you have to have a lot of liberty with the site to be able to do that. In most cases, people don't have that time for whatever reason. Money is a big reason you don't have the time. You don't have enough people. It's a natural disaster situation. You have to do it quickly. So the other alternative is to essentially rip the painting off the wall. So you glue paper, fabric, whatever to the front, but it's relatively minimal. And then you grab it and you yank it off the wall. And you hope most of the paint and plaster comes with it. Obviously, that's not the best way to do it. You inevitably lose some painting. But a lot of paintings, fresco paintings, have been removed in that way.
Wow. Very dramatic.
Yes, but and I wouldn't advocate that way. but once again, how many paintings have been saved that way? If they weren't removed that way, they would have disappeared with the building that they were attached to. So it's not the best way to do it, but if it's the only way, well, at least you preserve the painting.
Well, Perry, it has been such a pleasure to get to know you better through these 3 programs, and I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us and giving us more information about the paintings we all know and love. And we hope to continue our relationship with you for another 30 years.
Well, thank you, Michelle. It's been really nice working with you and Adam both on these series of talks. Like so many things, I mean, it's Belmont's a fantastic place. Melchers was a really good artist, And we've come to have this institution where so many people can come together to do fun things, interesting things, you know, enjoy nature, enjoy art, learn about Melchers and Gary and Corinne both. And it's great to work on a team to make that happen. So it's been a joy to work with you.
All right, thank you. And thank you for everyone for attending. We'll see you soon.
Thanks.